All right, can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys so much for coming out to today's seminar. We are very happy to have Dr. Heidi Lyn here from University of South Alabama. She comes to us from the psychology department. So a little bit of a switch up of our normal kind of Friday style seminar. So a little bit about Heidi Lyn. She did her bachelor's at the University of Pennsylvania and her master's and PhD at Georgia State. And she did that in psychology in comparative animal cognition and communication. So that's what she's going to be talking to us a little bit about today, kind of looking at a discussion on the methodological pitfalls and issues in the field of comparative psychology that we have today. So with that, here's Dr. Lyn.
Cool. All right, I'm double checking my mic. Is it working? Excellent. That's what I like to hear. All right, yeah, so I'm going to talk about sort of how do we try to look into the minds of non-human animals. Psychologists generally focus on humans for a very good reason, and that is that humans can talk to us. So we can ask them questions, and we can say, what do you think about this? And they can tell us. And we can't do that if we have non-human animals who do not have language. So we have to get very creative. But one of the questions I'm asked a lot is, why do we even care how intelligent animals are? This is a quick, brief picture showing that I do work with dolphins, or have, but I also work with apes. I also work with dogs. I also have students who are doing otter work, walrus work. We basically say, if there is a non-human animal and you have a question, let's try. Looking at is, how do different cognitive abilities or communicative abilities change, and what sort of environments and biologies support those changes? Most of the time, comparative psychologists focus in on non-human primates. It makes sense. They're the most closely related to us. We can immediately see that they are like us. This, by the way, this is a bonobo, and this is a chimpanzee. I'm going to be talking about bonobos a lot. They're very closely related to chimpanzees. They are a separate species. They have a completely different ecology. We'll talk about that a little bit. But the most important thing is they're matriarchal. The females run the whole thing. They also don't fight very much. Instead, they have a lot of sex. Franz de Waal calls them the make love, not war ape. So basically, if there's tension in the group and something is about to make somebody very angry, everybody has sex, and then it's all okay. That's absolutely true. Funny enough, dolphins also have a lot of sex. They don't seem to do it the same way as a tension releaser, though, so that also leads us to these interesting questions about how these behaviors are used to manage social interactions, right? But when we are asking questions, again, comparative psychologists basically have taken two routes. They've either gone rats, and they've said, well, learning processes should be the same across all species, so if we learn how rats learn, then we can say how everybody learns, and then we're done. That was the like 40s and 50s, right? They did that a lot. Or they say, well, let's look at the animals that are most closely related to us, and then what they do should tell us what we do, and then we're done. What I'm trying to say is that's not necessarily true. Their evolutionary path is still very different from ours. And we see these same kinds of behaviors in an extremely different species who has moved back into the water, who does not have hands, who has a completely different sensory system than us. So why does their cognition and communication look similar to ours when it does? What evolutionarily is driving that? Work, please. Thank you. So the main goal I have is to look across species, looking for these comparisons because we're looking for evolutionary convergence. I usually have this slide in and I talk a lot about it. I don't feel like I have to talk a lot about it here because I feel like you guys already know what I'm talking about when I say evolutionary convergence. But importantly, when we talk about evolutionary convergence, most of the time we're talking about physical convergence. We're talking about animals who evolved completely separately, but they have physical similarities to each other because of sort of also physics, right? The properties of the earth and how it moves. We have torpedo shapes in fish and dolphins and penguins, because that's the most efficient way to move through water. Wing shapes look the same because if you want to get off the ground, that's what your wing shape has to look like. Right? However, there's plenty of evolutionary convergence behaviorally as well, especially if we're talking about things like hovering flight. Well, if you're going to drink nectar from a flower, hovering flight is the way to go. If you're going to avoid predators and you live in a very large social group, moving all together at the same time and turning is really, really, really valid as predator avoidance. So that's why we see it in flying animals, in terrestrial animals, and in marine animals. The same behaviors occur over and over and over again. So what about cognitive and communicative convergence? I'm going to talk some about language later, but I just wanted to introduce you briefly to the apes that I did my PhD with. And these were mostly bonobos, but also chimpanzees that were reared at the Language Research Center in Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia State University. And they had a keyboard of over 200 symbols. They also understood English at the level of a 2.5-year-old child. So back when I said you can't talk to animals, well, you could talk to these guys pretty well. But as long as you were paying attention to the fact that they're basically a toddler. A toddler who could rip your arm off if they wanted to, right? It's a very different life that we live. But they were reared around toys. They were reared around humans. They had this 50-acre wood. This is a map of the wooded property that had different locations, had different foods that were found at those different locations. You could literally bring them out into the woods and say, where do you want to go today? And they would say, I want to go to A-frame. They do that by just pointing to A-frame, right, on the keyboard. You put them down and say, okay, take me there, and they would run in the direction of A-frame. They knew what those symbols represented and what they were used for. So now we have a very complicated communicative system that is clearly a human-based communicative system, but that is being caught up at least at an elementary level in a non-human species, something that absolutely was not considered to be possible before. So where are our boundaries now? Our boundaries that we thought we had now are starting to get shaky. An example of looking for other forms of cognitive convergence. Gallup in 1970 wrote the preliminary article on mirror self-recognition in non-human species. So what he did was with a lot of monkey species and apes, because comparative psychologists, non-human primates, that's what we do. So put up a mirror with them, showed that the apes eventually started behaving to the mirror as if they knew that it was themselves in the mirror. They would do things like look at their eye or try to look down their throat or something like that. And he wanted to test it. What he showed was initially animals ignore it. That's the simplest reaction to a mirror. A lot of animals have social behavior toward a mirror. If you've ever seen, well, a betta fish is probably the easiest one, right? They will attack a mirror. Birds attack mirrors all the time. Dogs will bark at mirrors. Some dogs will bark at mirrors. Some dogs will look behind the mirror to try and figure out where the dog is. But then you get these things like contingency checking. And contingency checking is basically what you do when you walk past a mirror and you didn't expect it to be there. And you sort of go, oh, it's me. Right? Or you wave at it. Oh, yeah, it's me. Animals will do that a lot. They'll stand at the edge of the mirror and just sort of go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then you get that self-directed behavior, looking at parts of the body that they couldn't see without the mirror, for example. Gallup came up with a classic mark test, which requires hands. What you do is, when the animal's asleep, you usually give them a sedative, they go to sleep, you put a paint splash or a mark on their forehead where they can't see it. When they wake up, they go over to the mirror. Do they reach for the monkey in the mirror, or do they reach for the mark that's on their forehead? Monkeys reach for the monkey in the mirror. Apes, great apes, reach for their forehead, generally. Chimpanzees, in particular, reach for their forehead pretty much all the time, at least if they've had enough exposure to mirrors. Requires hands, as I mentioned. And the more complex the interaction, the more it requires hands. So I'm going to show you a quick video of a chimpanzee. This is not a mirror anymore. He has a television camera and he has a flashlight.
If the image was live, they would often begin to use it to do things that they couldn't do when human, even though no one ever demonstrated such behavior for them. Austin discovered that when it is difficult to use a wide-open mirror to look down the throat, a TV view can stare right down the throat while you watch on television. Moreover, if you use a flashlight to light things up, you get an even better view.
Right, so here's what we're going to consider a very flexible behavior, a behavior that an animal has not learned, not seen, immediately recognizes. Oh, I want to see the back of my throat better. I can get down at this weird angle. He's also looking, by the way, the monitor is this direction, right? So the camera is here, the monitor is here, the flashlight is here, and he's juggling all three of those things, so just so that he can see down his throat. All right. So apes can pass the mirror test. What about dolphins, for example? Well, I worked with Diana Reese in her lab at New York Aquarium for a period of time, and she did this test. She has a mirror here. There's a tape marking where the actual mirror is. You'll also note there's a lot of reflective surface here. Right? Dolphins are pretty used to reflections, especially dolphins in human care. But this particular dolphin has been marked under his chin. And if anybody knows anything about dolphins, you'll know that this kind of behavior is not normal. This is not what dolphins do, generally. And then when he drifts out of the mirror range, he stops. Right? Even though there's a reflection there, it's not as good. He can't see as well, so it's not as interesting to him. So it looks like dolphins recognize their reflections in mirrors. Can we test it? Well, Diana created this test where she marked them with a marker, literally just a Sharpie, or marked them instead of, right, you don't have hands, so you can't do the reaching for the monkey in the mirror. Look instead at, if you pretend to mark them, let me back up and say too, you can't put them to sleep, right? You can't sedate them because dolphins are voluntary breathers. So if you sedate them, they stop breathing, and that's a terrible way to test them for mirror self-recognition. So instead of that, what she did is a sham mark. So she filled markers with water and then just pretended to put the mark on them and took a look to see, do they behave differently if there's a visual mark versus a sham mark? And the answer is yes. Right? There's the mark. They spend a lot more time in front of the mirror. The minute they're marked, they actually swim right down to the mirror and present that part of their body to the mirror. Highly suggestive mirror self-recognition. Not just in dolphins, by the way. This has been found in magpies. Actually, quite a number of corvid species, who are the sort of scary, smartest animals that I did not expect to be scary smart. Also, dolphins. Also, we did a number of studies where we were looking at other marine mammals. So here are some examples of what marine mammals look like in mirrors. This is a two-way mirror, so we're looking through the mirror now at them, and they're just looking at themselves. So belugas, I need to mute this puppy. Upside down, checking yourself out. This is a very young bottlenose dolphins. Humans actually don't respond well to the mark test until they're 18 to 24 months of age. Okay, so this is a developmental thing, that shift that happens about 2 years of age. This is an 18-month-old bottlenose dolphin who had stranded, Nicholas. Not only does he spend a lot of time really looking close up at his eye, he brought his toy over, and it is now doing loops in front of the mirror. So again, this seems strongly like he's recognizing himself in mirrors. Harbor seals. We did a test on harbor seal. This is the best harbor seal video that I have. Yeah, that's it. Harbor seals do not care about mirrors. Not even a little bit. Not even a little bit. But that's not to say that's true of all pinnipeds. So walruses, this is Ivic. He is very famous for masturbating in front of 4-year-olds. Like, this is what he does pretty much, is at the New York Aquarium. He's really interested in the mirror quite a lot. He obviously is very distracted right now. He's got his lady friend on the other side. But even with that massive distraction, he's still, it's very important, you know, you have to keep checking yourself out. We did get one good response to a mark test in the walrus. This is Upa. You can see this mark on her forehead right here. And this is the very first time she's marked. She sees it in the mirror, and then she swipes backward and just tries to swipe at it with her flipper. So even though they don't have hands, she's got flippers that can reach up there. That's the only response we had so far, though. So we need to do more walrus studies on this. So we have this behavior that looks like we can test across a large number of different species and look to see whether we have cognitive convergence and where we have it. So we have it in these weird places, right? We have walruses, but not harbor seals at all. We've got dolphins. We've got beluga whales. We've got magpies. And we've got apes. It's strange. So what we're doing at my lab is trying to sort of look at other cognitive abilities and trying to get as wide a range, similarly wide range of data collection as possible. Excuse me. One set we're doing is based on this primate cognition test battery. We're actually calling it the comparative cognition assessment. And in this case, we have a bunch of different tasks. Physical cognitive tasks, social cognitive tasks. Examples here, this video doesn't seem to work here, but this is basically transposition. This is, you have 3 cups. This is the shell game, is what it is, right? Put 3 cups, you hide a treat under one of them, you mix them all around. Can they follow the queen? Do they know where the shell is? This one is a social learning task, which is just gaze following. So what you'll see, Stu over here, yeah, that one's not working, is she'll give a treat to sort of center her and get her attention, and then she'll have another treat out, and then she's going to look up. Okay, so this is at Yerkes Primate National Research Center. Azalea, like, what are you looking at? Very persistent at it. Interesting thing that we found here. One thing, I was working in Bill Hopkins' lab, and he was looking for neural correlates of some of these behaviors, right? So he had MRI scans of all of these animals. So he was looking at structural anomalies in the brain to see if they correlated with their performance on these tasks. He found some. I was really looking more at, here's my belief. Most of it isn't biological. That's my strong belief, particularly in these large-brained, complicated, flexible species. I believe the vast majority of it is their social environment, their learning environment. What have they interacted with and done before? So here, I've compared those chimpanzees who were reared in a research facility to the chimpanzees and bonobos that were reared in the Language Research Center with all of the communication abilities. And what we see here is that, particularly in these social questions, the enculturated apes do significantly better. Not just significantly better, like they pass tests that the other apes don't. What this highlights to me is a lot of the time when we are making comparisons amongst animals, we aren't being methodologically sound. Because we're comparing them to kids or humans or dogs or whoever they might be who are reared in homes with humans, with people. And so when we're looking, especially when we're looking for behaviors that look like they're human behaviors, why would those appear naturally in wild chimpanzees? Why would they appear in chimpanzees who are reared in research facilities who have very little interaction with people? Especially, a lot of these chimpanzees are reared pretty solitary, right? They have completely abnormal social relations. So why do we expect them to be able to follow gazes, for example? The important thing here is, if we're going to compare them, we need to make sure that they have as close to the same rearing conditions, living conditions as possible. So here we have, relative numbers even. They're better at assessing how many treats are on a plate if they've been reared with people. Causality, if you shake a shaker and there's noise, they know better that there's something inside it than chimpanzees who haven't been raised around people. It's probably just familiarity with that object, right? An object that can contain things. Comprehension of points, we're going to talk a lot about that in a second. Production of points, those are human behaviors. Why would we see them unless they've had a lot of interaction with humans? And attentional state. This is just, again, showing that the enculturated apes are better at all tasks than the non-enculturated apes, but particularly better at social cognition. So this question I also get all the time, nature or nurture? That's a ridiculous question in my opinion. Never makes any sense. I always tell my animal behavior students, I'm like, if I ask you, is it nature, is it nurture, is it environment, or is it genetics? What is the answer? And then by the end of the semester, they all have to go, it's both. Yes, that's exactly right. It's always both. But this is true in animals, too. The big, splashy headlines that come out are not about it being both. They're about it being one or the other. They especially love it when there are species differences. And they can say things like, dogs can follow human points better than apes can. That is a big headline that has been coming out. Completely wrong. I'll talk about why that's true too. So we have to do comparative studies across multiple environments and sort of able to answer any of these questions. I'm just checking on the time. So we started doing this study with multiple different non-human primate species as a way to ease us into bigger comparisons. This is different measurements of physical cognition, the shell game basically, again, with old world monkeys, apes, prosimians, and low IQ and high IQ children with autism. And what you can see here is, first of all, prosimians are terrible. They're just really bad at it. You're literally just hiding a treat under a cup, and then you're giving them a choice, and they are randomly choosing. They're not paying attention to what you're doing. But what you see is that low IQ children with autism are actually underperforming most of the other non-human primate species. We also wanted to ask a question that a lot of people ask us too. If we're working with dogs, are small dogs dumber than large dogs? That's always the question they ask. Are small dogs dumber than large dogs? The answer is no, they are not. Especially, at least on spatial memory. They perform exactly the same as the large dogs. No difference whatsoever. And this was done with 40 dogs in each category at the Humane Society of South Mississippi. So we have a pretty broad spectrum of primates. Another example, this is my main interest, is communication and language. This is another question I ask my animal behavior students. What's the answer to this question? Do animals have language? Yes, no, or what do you mean by language? Well, what's the answer? C. It's always going to be C. I also very frequently have these questions where I'm like, it's this, it's this. I feel like this is a trick question. It's always the answer. Obviously, animals communicate. But human language is different from most animal communication. Exactly pinpointing that difference is harder than it seems. But we know that there is some semanticity, for example, in vervet monkey calls. They have 3 different alarm calls for 3 different types of predators, and they react differently to each one of those alarm calls. They show audience effects. They show learning effects. Okay, now we have something that's similar to a very simplified language. Honeybees, they have the waggle dance that communicates distance and direction of where the flower patches are. Whales, we know. Dolphins have signature whistles. This is Rico, a border collie who had a 200-word vocabulary. You could ask him to go into the other room and find one of 200 different toys, and he would search out the correct toy and bring it back to you. They did this test with another dog who knew 1,000 words. And if you left out 6 items that he knew and 1 item he didn't, and you gave him a new word, he would assume that that new word went with that new item and bring you back that new item. So he had flexible communicative behavior. This is not normal for dogs, by the way. If you feel like, oh, I'm a terrible dog owner because my dog can't do this, no. This is a lab in Germany, and they tested 300 dogs and found 1 other that had these capabilities. Now, this is likely due to our interference in their evolutionary system, right? We are driving their evolution in different ways. We've only found it in working dogs, like border collies, herding dogs mainly, border collies, Australian shepherds. Apparently, we've accidentally bred that into them. We weren't aiming for it. But how do we really boil down and test this then across these species if we can't get a lot of brilliant semantic dogs around? And of course, there's no money anymore for rearing bonobos in a 50-acre wooded area and teaching them English, right? No one's funding that anymore. This is the first keyboard study and the second keyboard study of savage rumba. That's where I did my PhD. And what you see is productive use of symbols kind of maxes out at that 200 or so. Anybody know how many words you know or college-age people know? Average? 50,000. So obviously the distinction between 200 and whatever and 50,000 is vast. There's also a shift that happens about 3 to 4 years of age where we start picking up words at a crazy clip. It's like 20 a day. We start picking up new words for a brief period of time, but it's called the word explosion. That happens when your 2-year-old just starts talking all the time, never shutting up, right? And then they start combining words in different ways, and that's when they start overproducing rules. The rules of grammar come in. That's something else we're not really seeing in these animals. So I wanted to do a real comparison between at least the 3 language projects that I had worked on. So this was the savage rumba one that I talked about, where they had the keyboard system, they understood English, they had the large 50-acre wooded colony where they could move around and asked to go places. And then there were 2 dolphin projects. So that one, obviously they could produce words on their keyboard, they could understand words in English. So they had both-way communication, 2-way communication going on. The dolphin projects were both one-way. This is Diana Reese's project that was in the mid-90s, and she had a keyboard system where dolphins could come up, push these keys. A whistle would sound, and it was a whistle that was within the frequency and time parameters of dolphin whistles, but was not in their repertoire at that time. And they would immediately be given whatever it was that key represented. So if they pushed the ball key, they got a ball. They pushed the frisbee key, they got a frisbee. If they pushed the fish key, they got a fish. That was a terrible idea. They took the fish key off really fast. Right? So, and then people would interact with the dolphins as well. So if they asked for a ring, they would give them a ring, and then they would stay around, and if they wanted to play with the person with the ring, then they would. The other one was the opposite direction. This is a comprehension study done in Hawaii at the KEWALO Basin Marine Mammal Lab. And this was Lou Herman's work that he did with mainly with 2 dolphins. This is a KEMMI, this is Phoenix. They had 2 different modalities. A K was taught a gestural system like this. So mouth would be done like this, and spit would be done like that. You also had ball, you had basket, you had frisbee, you had a lot of different gestures that meant different things. You also had right and left for modifiers. Phoenix was given an auditory communicative system where whistles were played into the water. And she had all of the same nouns, all of the same actions, over, under, fetch, which meant bring to. But she had, instead of right and left, she had surface and water, or surface and bottom, right? So there could be a hoop on the surface and a hoop on the bottom, and you could say, go over the hoop on the surface, and she would jump over the hoop on the surface as opposed to paying attention to where the bottom hoop was. Oh, they also had different syntaxes. So they were, all the words were arranged in different orders. So the easy one, a KEMMI, you would say ball over, which meant jump over the ball. Phoenix, it would say over ball, right? So you'd flip them. But when you had transitive and intransitive objects, so for Phoenix, you could say ball, fetch, frisbee, which meant take the ball to the frisbee. This makes perfect sense to us, right? For a K, that would actually be frisbee, ball, fetch. Okay? Take the second object to the first object. This led to a lot of interesting errors. Right, so they were tested only on comprehension. There was no production. However, we saw a lot of strong analogies between the apes and the dolphins when it came to learning these communicative tasks. The dolphins began to mimic in the keyboard system. It didn't have comprehension, it was just production, right? They started actually just whistling the whistles that the keyboard was whistling as well. So after only 19 exposures to the ball whistle, one of the dolphins came over to the keyboard, pushed the ball, and then whistled the ball symbol. The very next time he came over, pushed it, and whistled the ball signal along with the computer. And then the next time he came over, whistled the ball symbol, then pushed the button, and then the computer whistled it. And then they did a behavioral correlation and showed that when they were away from the keyboard and playing with the ball, and we gave them novel names, and we played with them in front of the apes. They didn't even get to interact with them necessarily. And then we tested them on them that same day. And Kanzi here, 5 times out of 10, got it right the very first try. Immediately what they call fast mapped. They mapped that association between the symbol and the object very quickly. They also produce combinations. They weren't required to produce combinations if they wanted something, right? They could just ask for an apple or an orange or whatever it might be, but they started combining things. And an in-depth analysis of how the apes combined their symbols and how a small child in the one-word stage combined their symbols showed that they did it pretty much the same way. But this was symbolic, not grammatical, right? There are no categories like noun or verb. But based on what the intention of the meaning of those specific symbols were, they would combine them in different ways. So for example, human children would do things like identification, like see doggy, or talk about location, book there. Agent, action, mama walk, that means mama is supposed to walk, right? Action, direct object, hit you, I'm going to hit you. Action, instrument, cut, knife, cut the knife. The apes, action object, open peach. That actually meant cut it with a knife and open it. Entity demonstrative, this is just like identification, monster, and then pointed to the monster. Like, that's a monster. Action agent, chase you. Affirmative goal, they did this all the time. Yes, outdoors. Yes, outdoors. Entity location, orangutan colony room, that's where the orangutans were, so we're going to talk about the orangutans. Dolphins also started combining their whistles. This is the ball whistle. This is the ring whistle. About the second year of the project, they started singing this, which looked a lot like the ring combined with the ball. When they saw this, This is just to show you it wasn't just one. There's a whole bunch of times when they were doing this. They were doing it a lot. And when they were doing it, they were playing with the ring and the ball at the same time. And that was a new behavior, and that whistle showed up at the same time. That, by the way, they couldn't ever hear that on the computer because there was a half-second buffer between the two key presses that was built in. So that combination, jamming those together, was something that the dolphins did organically, having never heard it. Comprehension of sequences. This is where it gets really fun. This is Kanzi, and these are the two sequences he's going to get. Take the chow outdoors and go get the ball that's outdoors. You can see those are complicated because the structure of the sentences is opposite. But Kanzi doesn't have a problem with this. Oh, I turned off the sound. Take the chow outdoors. This is my favorite one because the ball that he goes and gets looks nothing like a ball currently. And also he walked past a ball. Look at this, it's smashed. And there's a ball that he literally walked past to go get that smashed ball that was outdoors. So the richness of their interpretation of those words is actually pretty stellar, right? It's pretty strong. Dolphins were pretty good at their comprehension task too. This is Robin Williams. He did come to see us. Hoop through. Here's another good story. This is a bottom hoop, right? It sits on the bottom. Hoop through and hoop under were trained at the surface. And under specifically was a behavior that was trained where the dolphins would go upside down, so belly up under the hoop. She can't do that when the hoop's on the bottom, right? Because she just doesn't have enough buoyancy to kick it up. So she just went under it. Again, sort of showing that it's not she's not associating mechanically that behavior with the symbol. She's associating much more generally the action and even that prepositional positioning of that action to the hoop. So it's a more complicated understanding of what those symbols mean than what we see in most other non-human animals. This is surfboard person fetch, and that she's going to go get the person and take it to the surfboard. This allows us again to look at rule-based systems because we can say person surfboard fetch, which means take the surfboard to the person, right? So this is the difference between man bites dog and dog bites man. Word order has meaning for these guys. This is just categorization. We looked at vocabulary errors. This was my dissertation, and what we found was that the apes made more errors within categories than outside of categories, and that those categories were actually hierarchical. So food categories, they would obviously confuse foods with foods pretty often, but then they would also confuse drinks with drinks more often. Lemonade and orange drink, for example, were a consistent confusion. Locations and animates. This is true of people too. When we make speech errors, these are exactly the kinds of errors that are most frequently found. And when I did this analysis, you could actually see that they made errors based on category, on the physical attributes of the items, on the English pronunciation of them, and on their lexigram similarity, the similarity of the keys on the keyboard. What this actually means is that the conception within their brain of these symbols includes all of that information. So just like if we get primed, if I say rabbit to you, and then I ask you, how do you spell hare? You are more likely to spell it H-A-R-E if I say rabbit, right? Because that's been primed in your brain. Those connections in your brain are now more active than they were before. This strongly suggests that that same web of understanding is inside the brain of the apes when it comes to these semantic symbols. The dolphins didn't have a lot of options for this because they only had 10 or 15 different words, but you did see some of these same categorical confusions, suggesting that that might also be true of dolphins, but we need a lot more information. Sorry. I'm going to run out of time because I talk a lot. This is one of the things I do a lot is right now is looking at declarative communication, particularly pointing behavior, because it's been controversial in the field, because there's been a large suggestion that dogs can follow points better than apes can. My apes, the apes I worked with, point all the time and follow points really, really, really well. My dog cannot follow a point to save her life. Right? So I just didn't believe that that was true. I looked first into the utterance data by the apes and showed that they make lots of declarative utterances where they're just talking about things, and very similar types of declaratives to kids. With the dogs and the apes, with the point comprehension, they mainly focus on the object choice task. And this is where you have, again, sort of two cups. But when they can't see you, you hide a treat under one of them. And then you point to one of them. And if they pick the one that you're pointing to, then supposedly they understand that you're trying to communicate with them that that's where the treat is. Okay. They've done this with lots of animals. Apes have not done very well on this task, generally. Dolphins have done great on this task, especially these dolphins, who I would consider enculturated. Elephants, dogs, lots of different species. Do you see a methodological problem here? They can't, no. So what we actually do is they have odor, they control for odor cues, things like that. But look at the point gesture here versus the point gesture here. Look at the fact that this ape is behind multiple layers of glass. And these animals are right in front of the individual. Methodologically, they have not been directly comparable at all. So we said, well, we're going to do it. By goodness. We're going to do it with our language competent apes. This is Kanzi. And the apes that are at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center. What do we find? Enculturated apes can do this great. They are really good at this. Like 95 and 100% good at it. Non-enculturated apes, not so good. But even with non-enculturated apes, if you look across all of their data and you combine enough of them, they're still above chance. So they're still getting that information somehow, but it's being dismissed because it doesn't fit the narrative or get a lot of attention when you talk about it that way. We did this exploration where we looked specifically at it, and the only thing that made a difference with the apes as to whether they could pass this test or not was whether they had a ton of human interaction. Enculturated apes. Way better at it. Other methodological differences. The size of the point. So what we're doing right now, I showed, and a different researcher also showed, that if you're pointing gigantically like this, distal pointing, apes are really good at that too, even if you have a barrier up there. New data showing that dogs are not very good if you have a barrier. Not surprising. Also, kids, not very good if you have a barrier. And now you're going to tell me that kids can't follow points? Pretty sure they can. I can't go, I'm just going to show you a very brief version of this. And this is just, we did this with dogs. And we just varied up where the cups were placed and how close our point was to the cup. So this is proximal. Proximal, it means that the cups are about 2 to 3 feet apart, and our point is right next to the cup. Dogs are really good at this, because if they can follow your point right down to where the cup is, stimulus enhancement. It has nothing to do with communication. Proximal distal is the tricky one. This is when the cups are close together and the points are further away. Again, I'm out of time. Distal, distal, this is the standard one. Watch what the dog does here. Does that look like that dog is understanding the communicative nature of that point? Not even a little bit, right? And what we found is that dogs generally do this. They run into your arm or they touch your hand, and then they follow it that way. They're not paying attention to the communicative nature at all. Dogs and apes are worse at proximal distal than they are at the other two. So that methodological change is extremely meaningful. And then this is just our intention of looking at ostensive cues. That is, are they paying attention to whether I'm communicating with you or not? So we did a cross-body point. So if I pointed this way, that meant you're supposed to go this way. If I pointed like this, you're supposed to go that way. Also, we dropped or kept eye contact, right? So either I would say like, oh, right? And sometimes I would glance over there. Or I would do this. Look down. Dogs didn't care if I was looking at them or not. Apes, 100% if I'm looking at them. Flat chance if I'm not looking at them. These were enculturated apes, right? So clearly, again, drilling down on the methodology tells me that apes are understanding the communicative nature of these gestures and dogs are not. Exactly the opposite of what the big splashy headlines have been. And that's just giving me that. I have no idea what I'm doing. Dogs and cross-body points, let me tell you, they are so confused. And the main reason is they'll follow your point or they'll follow your elbow. And they don't care what the difference is. They're just terrible at it. This is just showing you how bad they are. Just bad, bad, bad. Don't have time to do signature whistles of dolphins. This is something we're looking at. Exchanges of signature whistles during an introduction. We're looking for referential vocalizations right now. We had a big television. Right now we have it actually being projected onto an underwater window. And we have it so that if they whistle, their whistles will show up on the screen. And we're looking to see if we can start showing them a whistle and if they can match it. And then they can get something for that. So step one into the brave new world of communicative interactions. Right. Environment is really important. That's really my take-home message. Methodology is very important. If you're going to be looking for these differences across animals, you have to drill down to the methodology, look at the behavior. Don't just look at your testing, like the responses, because that's not telling you the whole story. This is just another series. I do a lot of stuff. My students do a lot of stuff, and I have been labeled the lab that doesn't say no. Come to me for an idea. I'm going with you. Just other things that are happening. This is bush baby agonistic aggressive grooming in primates. We're finding it. Also, factory enrichment. I do a lot of in human care work. So we want to look to see if we can improve welfare while we're at it. That's enrichment. Again, this is dolphins' reaction to vessels in the Mississippi Sound is dependent on vessel type. Should not be a shock to anybody here, I'm sure. Dolphins react more poorly to jet skis and loud motorboats than they do to sailboats. Shocking information, I know. But this one is really cool. This is a student who worked at the Navy with the bottlenose dolphins there and looked at dolphins' responses to different noises, anthropogenic noises, and showed that they adjust their vocalizations depending on what noises are around them. So if you have low noises, dolphins will whistle higher than normal. If you have high noises, dolphins will whistle lower than normal, and they're projecting a lot more energy. So they're more energetic. This is basically this idea that if you're in a bar and there's a lot of noise, you have to talk louder and you have to talk differently than you normally do. And that actually can be an energetic drain. And that is what I have.